Hello and welcome to Dan, originally from Canada, which we're going to get into, and now here in Australia, an online mate from the Investor Accelerator trading program. Welcome aboard, Dan.
Great to be here, Carrie. Thanks for having me.
It's gorgeous to see you. I've seen you online for quite some time. I think we've crossed paths for over a year now, I'm sure. I've been seeing your name.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I've definitely been part of Investor Accelerator for over a year or nearing a year now. And then, yeah, I think we were going to swap a few books back and forth, you and I.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Yes, I remember that discussion.
Yeah.
And then I took a little bit of time off whilst my life was in disarray and just kind of returned recently. So, Dan, I'm going to take you down the path of our usual meandering wander into your life because I want to explore all about you and your history and kind of what brought you here and what brought you to this point and what brought you to Bitcoin
Yeah.
as well as trading, but Bitcoin in particular, obviously, because that's the focus of this podcast. So I know you grew up in Ontario. I don't know a lot about Ontario. I've not visited Canada. It's on my list. It's probably on my list for skiing as
Definitely.
much as
Yeah.
anything else. So tell me about you and tell me about your upbringing in Ontario.
Yeah. So I was born in a little mining town, a little place called Elliott Lake, which is, if you haven't heard of it, you're not really missing much. It's a little, it's
What
a
kind of
little
mining?
Uranium of all things.
Really?
Yeah, and then I ended up moving to another town a couple of hours away called Sudbury, which, long story short, it was one of the biggest nickel copper sort of mines in the area. So it was definitely a bit of a rough mining town type of upbringing. But I will say it was really quite neat because the area that I grew up, there was 10,000 lakes within, I think it was 1,000 kilometers of where I was born. So it was all lots of outdoor living. Like you said, skiing, snowmobiling in the winter, snowboarding, a lot of outdoor activity. So it was fishing, hunting, all that kind of stuff. So it was definitely a really nice spot to be, but very remote, very isolated. It was sort of off the grid, which was definitely my sort of living.
That's interesting. So your parents were involved in mining or?
It was my parents directly, no, but just that in the area, that town is quite, is quite well known, in the mining sector, particularly around uranium, was the big one in back in the day. The mines have since shut in that small town that I was from,
Right.
Elliott Lake, but in Sudbury, the copper and the nickel mine, that's yeah, one of the bigger mines, I believe, in Ontario at least, and if not in Canada.
I'm thinking about, do you know who owns that copper mine? Is that a
Uh,
listed stock? Now I'm curious.
Yeah. It was owned by a Canadian company for a while called Inco.
Yeah.
And then it was bought by a Brazilian company, I think called Vale. So I think they're quite a big one. I'm not too sure, but anyway, it's basically
Yeah.
one of the biggest sectors in that particular town. It was definitely a mining town. There's no doubt about it.
And the uranium got shut down, the uranium mine.
Yeah, so in Elliott Lake, it was big in the 60s, to my understanding. It was so a lot of the uranium, it's kind of a bit of a horrible story, but a lot of the uranium that sort of went into the nuclear weapons for the Cold War and that kind of stuff, back in the 60s and that time period, there was definitely a boom bust cycle that took place in the town that I was.
Boom. Sorry.
Ex- You said it out
Go
loud,
ahead.
not me. But yeah, no, it was yeah. So anyway, this little town, it was really, it was quite a popular. It was I believe all the everybody flooded from the cities into this little town. So it was a population of, I think, 50,000 or 60,000 in the 60s. But then when I was living there, in the 90s and 2000s, it was like, I think, population 15,000 or something like that. It was very, very
Oh,
small town. So
really
not a
dwindled.
lot happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, you got drawn into music. So you were doing all this kind of outdoorsy living, which sounds heavenly. Uh, and you're saying maybe a bit of a rough mining town. So I'm interested, was there much music going on? How do you as an individual get involved down that track?
Yeah, so I would say I grew up in a bit of a musical family. Like my grandfather played a bit of guitar, and there was definitely music around. I think when I was probably 10 or 11, even younger than that, I started playing piano. I did the whole classical training piano sort of thing and all of that stuff,
Oh, yeah.
as most parents chuck their kids into music lessons and, hope that they're going to become the next Beethoven, I suppose. So that was sort of how I got into music. But when I was quite young, I realized I could sort of I could figure out the songs on the radio at like, 10 years old or whatever. I was quite young, and I was really sort of realized I was figuring it out. I sort of had a bit of an understanding of it. So that's when I started getting into guitar and drums and a bunch of other instruments. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of music in the community, I would say, but I think just I really sort of stuck to it when I was a young kid, and it gave me something to do in the small town.
Do you have an explanation for that? I've got a girlfriend who was a nanny, and she was nannying for a couple. They had two kids, and the mother was like this piano prodigy who had I think what had happened was her sister was doing piano lessons. She'd been dragged along, just to wait whilst the piano lesson played out. There was a break in the piano lesson, and she, at the age of 3 or something, toddled into the piano room, hopped up on the piano, and just started playing.
Mm,
Do you
it's
have any
interesting, isn't it?
like, where did yours come? Like, do you have an explanation for yours? Yes, it's in the family, but clearly it wasn't huge in the family.
Yeah, I'm not too sure, Carrie, because it's interesting. At least what I've noticed in my experience, of doing this sort of semi-professionally for the past 10 or so years, like I've noticed there's sort of two camps. You either have the people who are religiously note driven, like the people who read music and are very much, into what's written in front of them. And then you have the whole other school of thought, which is sort of where I fall into, which is, I don't read a note of music, but it sort of just came intrinsically. So it almost seems like there is that separation between, not that one's better than the other, but there definitely does seem to be a bit of there just tends to be people who it's more of a natural thing, and people who, maybe have it's just interesting, I suppose, altogether.
Yeah, it
I don't know.
really is. So were
Yeah.
you getting involved in bands and things? Did you have a couple of mates you were doing a band with in high school, like everybody does?
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, a couple friends when I was young. We just started playing some music. One friend in particular, I started doing a lot of like duo shows with and whatnot. And at the time that I was coming out of high school and going into uni, doing that sort of thing, I realized, I could actually, oh, okay, I could actually make a bit of bit of money doing this. So I realized, it's not as far-fetched as I thought to, maybe start doing this a bit more on the professional side. So that was how I sort of ended up working towards. I started working in the bars and doing a lot of restaurants and some local festivals and that kind of stuff. And it eventually turned into a job working on the cruise lines, which was as a performer, which is quite cool.
Absolutely, it is really cool. Hang on, let's just fill in a couple of missing blanks before you jump ahead to the cruise line. So let me go back to, what were you studying at uni?
So I studied Canadian history, and I was actually,
Really?
yeah, I was interested in from a historical side. I think truthfully it was probably because I had a really cool history teacher in high school,
Yeah,
and
we
I don't
often
know
have
if
an influence, hey?
yeah, big time, and I just loved the way that he delivered his lessons. You know what I mean? He was
Mm.
very like he really was engaging. He was like one of those people that could really engage you in his lesson. So I think at that point it was sort of a no-brainer for me. Like, and I already sort of had a bit of an interest in history, but yeah, and I sort of realized after high school I'd like to maybe teach, become a teacher. So I did my undergrad through uni, and then that was sort of when I started playing music sort of semi-professionally, and that was when I sort of realized that was when the cruise offer sort of came along. So I ended up sort of putting the teaching thing on the back burner and carrying on with the music.
So was the uni, did you have to move out of home to go to uni? Because, yeah.
No, 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 no. I was actually really lucky because in Sudbury, the town that I lived in with the bigger mining infrastructure, there's a really nice university. So I ended up being able to stay at home while I studied. So that was really nice on the bank account.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. You got siblings?
I've got a younger sister. She's actually just graduated law school and is working at a law firm now. So back in Canada.
Musical? Is she musical?
Not a note.
Wow. So, again, that whole interest of the kind of the environment versus genetics always interests
Hmm.
me there, how different two siblings can end up being.
Hmm.
All right then. So you're living at home, you're studying history. I'm still not going to jump into the cruise thing because I'm actually really interested in Canadian history.
Hmm.
I know very little about it. We hear everything about American history, and of course, I've got a reasonable idea of some European history because I did a fair bit of history at school
Hmm.
and Australian history. I don't know anything much about Canadian history. How do
Hmm.
they teach it? What do they get into? Is it more about the politics? Is it about the Indigenous people? Is it about like how do they approach it?
It's, I would say, actually having learned a lot about Australian history, having moved here, it's a very similar story. The only major difference in, a very concise short form version, there were really two parts of Canadian history. You had French Canada and English Canada for the longest time. The French came
Okay.
over, the English came over. They were trying to decide, who's more important and who deserves the land. And but it's very similar to Australian history in regards to sort of the indigenous history. That's definitely has a very similar. The history has definitely repeated itself in that regard. So
Yeah, right.
it's a very similar story. But yeah, in school, I would say it's my wife is a teacher, so I sort of get to learn what she's teaching her students and what sort of part of the curriculum here, and it's a shockingly similar history.
Yeah, right. And the US could probably say something similar. Yeah,
Mm,
interesting stuff in terms of the beginnings, like the
mm.
origin stories, and then the kind of development since then. Yeah, you're
I
right.
don't think there's many countries on the planet that can't say that don't have the same story, right? The British came and took over,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
right?
yeah. The British, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. Yeah.
Mm, exactly.
In that era of exploration.
That's it.
Do you keep up any history studies? Do you still read history books? Are you still interested?
Oh, I wish I could say I did more, but yeah, it was one of those things that at the time I probably took it for granted,
Mm.
because you're learning about it every day, you're doing assignments, just the whole uni experience, right? You're like, oh, I've got to do this assignment. Really, I'm not really feeling this, and you don't really think much about the content. But then after you graduate, at least I've found now that I've graduated, I've actually taken on more appreciation for what was, what I was learning, if that makes sense.
Have you gone down the path, as a lot of people do in the Bitcoin community, of the history of money?
The history of money.
Money.
Oh, I've definitely well, I've learned a lot through TIA, just with regards to the cycles and Phil Anderson's book. That's been particularly eye opening, especially when it comes to just sort of how money has progressed over time, and how we sort of moved away from the gold standard and all that. It's really mind blowing stuff, isn't it?
It really is, and it actually ties in with some of the very early history in many ways of countries being taken over. Robert Breedlove tells an interesting story, which I have seen written elsewhere. I've seen it on Looking Glass Education as well, where some of the African countries were easily taken over by Europeans because they were using glass beads as their form of
Mm.
money. Have you heard the story? Do you know about
I,
that?
I do know that a lot of cultures, of that era were, did tend to use, very similar stories with currency and, the transactions and how, trading assets, were done with, you know,
Absolutely. And of course, the Europeans kind of went, oh, bonus, we can just make glass beads at a dime a
exactly.
dozen, and
Yeah.
just basically walked in under economic takeover,
Yeah.
like just
Yeah.
bought their way in, as it were. Okay, so let's come on back around. So there you are studying history at uni, playing music. What kind of music?
Mostly acoustic stuff. Mainly just because it's easier. I don't have to deal with bands. I
Yeah,
don't have to
right.
deal
Okay.
with temperamental musicians.
And
I
you
can just
don't
sort of.
sing, do you sing as
I
well?
do, yeah, yeah. I'm a singer, songwriter, guitar player, piano player. I
I can see your guitar in the background and the drums and the piano. So at the end of this, do we get a tune?
depends on what you're paying. No, I'm joking.
Well, you're not getting any of my Bitcoin,
I
so
love it. I'll send you my
in
Bitcoin
fiat you
address.
can
How's
have
that sound?
it. All right, so you're playing your acoustic, you're studying history, and you've alluded to the fact that you get this offer on the cruise liners. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I was playing around locally, doing some sort of local events, a lot of that kind of stuff, and I sort of had an inkling that I definitely was, planning to pursue music to some degree, but I was sort of torn whether or not I go to school or sorry, if whether I sort of pursue teaching or what the correct thing for me to do was. A long story short, I ended up putting in an application for just a Canadian company that sort of pitches you to the cruise lines. So I didn't really think much of it because I sort of submitted this application. But the very next day, they called me and they said, "Do you mind? Do you want to come work in Australia?" And I said, "Oh wow, like that was quick." And they said, "Yeah, like we've got an opening for 2 weeks from now, so and we need it filled. Do you want it?" And I was like, "Oh wow." So I took a bit of a leap. It was a massive leap of faith because I had about 6 months worth of bookings sort of all lined up and everything like that. And I
Oh,
really,
wow.
yeah, back home in Canada. So I was sort of on the fence. Do I do this? Do I take this leap of faith and sort of jump to the cruise lines? Like, what if I hate this and I've canceled everything back home type of situation? So I long story short, I mean, long story short, long story long. No, what's the saying on that? Anyway,
Long
uh,
story, whatever length it is, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I ended up just sort of trusting my gut and giving it a crack. And so I worked for Princess exclusively. So yeah, so they gave me.
Herbal, because that was the start of COVID in
Oh,
Australia
I
was
know.
Princess,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Actually, I spent a bit of time on the Ruby Princess in Alaska. I did a season in Alaska on that ship, so I know the Ruby well. And as soon as I found out it was here in Australia, bringing COVID and spreading it to the masses, I was thinking, oh great, this is fun. It brought back
Okay.
some great memories.
So what happened? So you had to isn't it amazing how life just turns on a dime? You're
It-
just like your life would have been just completely different.
exactly. Yeah.
It's just unfathomable. Or just what if, what if I'd
Mm,
stayed? It's a sliding doors moment, isn't it?
it really is. And the other thing too, like I was thinking about this the other day, like in Sudbury, like you're easily like a 25-hour drive before you're ever going to hit an ocean. So like there's no cruise ships, there's no, it's inland, like remote inland Canada. So like, you're not anywhere near an ocean. And to think that I'm like, here I am working on a cruise ship, traveling, to all these amazing coastal cities, like it was just, yeah, to think, it's really amazing when you think
Crazy.
about it. Yeah.
So so you've got 2 weeks. You have to cancel all your gigs, you have to pack, you have to sort out visas or, all the paperwork, I'm assuming.
Yeah, luckily, when you book through an agency, when they sort of take care of the bulk of that, they organize the flights, they organize all that stuff. So, but on my end, it was okay. I guess I'm going in 2 weeks. So, what do I need to do? I gotta entertain people on cruise ships. Like, better figure out what I need. And
What did your friends and family say?
it was pretty last minute, like just how quickly it happened. But I was like, oh, I mean, everybody was really happy for me, and yeah, and I mean, in hindsight, it was like you said, it was one of those sliding door moments where it's like, had I not done that, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have, you know what I mean? Like a life sort of just unfolds in that way when it sort of all comes together.
Yeah, it is. It's just weird and wonderful, isn't it? So tell us about life on a cruise ship.
That's yeah, it was.
Or what happens on the cruise ship
Oh,
stays on the cruise ship.
oh, I was more so thinking like it had amazing advantages in the sense that you got to travel, you got to see the world, and I was probably one of the more fortunate ones, in terms of work on board because I got to play music, and I could travel during the day. I could go go ashore and spend my time however I wanted and come
Right.
back and play music at night. And, I sort of had the best of both worlds in that sense. But on the flip side, you're living out of a suitcase. You're never in one particular place. So there's pros and cons. I really did enjoy it for the time that I did it, but I think I'm happy. I'm on, terra firma.
How long did you do it for?
I did it for nearly 4 years. Yeah,
So
off and on, obviously. So I'd be on the ship for a contract, finish that contract, go home for a bit of a break, and then be shipped off to a different ship.
did you get to know, like, did you have similar crew from one ship to another, or were you always on a different ship meeting a whole new set of people every time?
It was a bit of both. You'd always go to a new ship not knowing who you'd recognize, and you'd get there and it would just be filled with people that you knew from all over the world, people that crew members you met on other ships. Or it was really quite cool. Or you'd see other entertainers that you've worked with on other ships, that would be coming and going and joining at different times to you. Or yeah, it was really quite a small family, believe it or not, even though there were 20 or 25 ships.
How did you feel? I'm assuming on the cruise ship you'd have to play pretty mainstream music. How did you feel about doing that night after night? Or
I was pretty lucky because I did do the cover stuff, but one of my sort of things is I like to put my own spin on things and sort of make it a bit more. So you'll know the song, but I'll definitely do my own thing with it. It just sort of keeps it fresh for me too. That way I'm not sort of stuck doing the same thing on repeat. But I was really lucky because I had sort of worked out with the cruise lines to actually be able to sell my music on board in the shops and whatnot. So and play my music. So I kept it fresh by sort of introducing my own original stuff in there too and whatnot. So it sort of just added a bit of flavor to a otherwise monotonous
yeah,
situation. But no, it's great. You meet people from all over the world. You travel. You get to experience different cultures and yeah, it was an unbelievable experience.
I don't know if this is a theme within Bitcoiners or whether it's self-selecting for the people who are putting their hands up for the podcast, but music is coming through as a moderately strong theme, so that kind of creative thing. And also this kind of spirit of adventure and just dropping stuff on almost a whim and heading off into. So where was that always part of your nature? I mean, you grew up in a very stable and small, and I can imagine a lot of people in a small town stay in the small town for life.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that for you? Was that always there?
Oh, I think I knew growing up that I'd probably end up doing something else, but I suppose I'd never really thought about it. Like I could have very well have just ended up, staying there, working at the mine or doing something, and I think I probably could have been happy had I stayed home and done that. But I just think it probably was a bit of like, okay, this opportunity's here. I better jump on it, So I think it was sort of like pack your bags because this is happening, whether you're ready for it or not. So yeah, it's I don't know. It's just strange how.
Have you got friends back home who have just stayed in the town, or have a lot of people have most moved out? Yeah,
It's a
no,
bit
well said.
interesting. I'm sure you can probably relate, but it's like when I go back home, sometimes you see people you haven't seen in 10 years and you think, wow, you have not changed at all in 10 years, So,
Yeah.
and I think it's not in a bad way, there's, well, I mean, some people you think, wow, it's a
Really?
bad way. Exactly. But for the most part, you just think, wow, like, I've been, at least for me, I feel like it's been so eye-opening just getting to see what I have and to, I just feel incredibly fortunate to get to, say that I've done what got to see what I have and sort of get out of that that small town mindset.
Yeah. Where did you meet your wife along the way? Was that on the cruise ship?
So I was working here in Australia. So between cruises and whatnot, I was spending a bit of time in Australia. I realized I had 3 weeks here and there and whatnot. So I did a lot of traveling around Sydney, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, that kind of thing. So I met my wife while doing that. And yeah.
Whereabouts? Give me the story. Tell me.
Oh, the
Was it at a
story.
pub? Was it? It clearly wasn't online. It was in person. Yeah.
No, yeah, no, met her while I was working on the ships. But long story short, she was in the Brisbane area. But we sort of realized there was a bit of a connection. We're like, okay, there's something going on here. But I was still, contracted to the ship, so it was a bit like, okay, well, I'll be back in Brisbane in 2 weeks. You want to maybe grab a coffee? And then before we knew it, it was, oh, well, my ship's relocating down to Sydney. And then she's like, oh, well, I'll make a quick flight down to Sydney. And I was like, okay, so there must be something here if she's willing to fly all the way to Sydney to hang out with me. And yeah, long story short, yeah, fast forward, it was, she came back to Canada a few times, met the family. I subjected her to the small town syndrome. And then beyond that, yeah, it was more so just a decision, do I move to Australia or does she move to Canada? And after 20 years of minus 20 and 6 feet of snow, I said, it's not happening. I'm moving to Australia.
I've got to tell you, and it's controversial to even say this, but I've been reading a little bit of Jordan Peterson's story recently, growing up in a small town in Canada. The cold, the long, dark winters, the nothing to do in a small town, the boredom, and how much kind of happened in terms of, people just getting stuck there, smoking dope and getting depressed, really.
Pretty much.
And either you've got the spirit to get out. And it was an interesting comment he made about almost exactly as you've just said. You either knew you were getting out, and everyone who knew they were getting out just knew they were getting out, and those who knew they were staying, it was very clear from very early on, but unspoken, who would be leaving and who would be staying, as it were. Which is an interesting thought. Yeah, I don't think I could cope with that in Canada. Now, okay, so you've met your wife. You've finished with the ships now. So what finished that up? Was that your choice? Did you just go, enough already, I want to settle down?
Pretty much, yeah. I'd sort of got to a point where, I knew I was sort of at a point where it had run its course. I was probably ready to settle down a bit more so just, get away and be on ground, drive my car and go through a drive-through and, all these sort of things that you take for granted when you're living on a floating cork. So yeah, it was sort of just it was coming to an end. I sort of felt like I had, I'd done the travel thing. It was, I'd done the adventurous living. It was time to sort of maybe plant my feet on solid ground again. And I'd spent quite a bit of time on the Gold Coast, and in the area. So I sort of knew what I was getting into, coming here, and it felt quite familiar.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you stayed in, like, that would have, I mean, a perfect timing in many ways. Like in Australia, we often go do the great Aussie backpack around Europe in our 20s. And it's a good time to go and explore the world and expose yourself to different cultures and different people and different ideas and different lifestyles. And you mature over that time. I didn't mature very much, but you might have. So could you almost identify who you were before you started traveling and who you were afterwards, how it changed you, how you morphed?
I would say for me, it actually, it was interesting. Actually, I think because like for me, coming from that small town, I sort of thought, okay, I'm out of this sort of, I'm not working, I'm not going to school. I'm not doing something locally. I sort of thought, okay, I better do this right. You know what I mean? So I sort of felt that, I, how do I explain it? I suppose I felt like if I did it wrong or if I was careless, that I would just, that it wasn't that far backwards to fall to, to go back to the town and sort of falling back into that sort of lifestyle, if that makes sense. So I almost felt like my maturity actually increased, if that makes sense, as I was going through it, because I almost felt like, you see people, at least I noticed on the ships, particularly the crew, a lot of them would, there'd be people who spent more than they made in a month because,
Right.
they're traveling, they're just spending as they go. They're not, and before they know it, they're in the same position that they were before,
Mm,
before they got on the ship, as they are when they left. So I suppose, for me, it was always like, okay, well, if I'm smart with my money, I have zero, at least from a financial
mm,
standpoint, I had no expenses. Like, you live on a ship, you're getting paid in US, you don't pay for anything. You have food, you have accommodation, you travel, you live on the ship. So it's the opportunity to save money. So I was like, I was probably a little bit too frugal at times, because I was like, oh, I'm just going to save my money now. And in hindsight, it was great. So but at the beginning, I was like, oh, I'm here to travel. And then as I did more and more and more, I realized, oh, well, if I save this, I'll probably be planning for a bit of a future. So in hindsight, I'm really glad that, I'd probably say I'm similar to how you were, where, you know,
mm.
you start traveling and you think, oh yeah, like, I'm moving in that direction. I'm here to experience things. But then the more you do it, you're like, okay, well, I actually need to start thinking about what I'm doing in the future.
Good for you. So you said in our little pre-questionnaire that you never wanted to live beyond your means and that you're not, you don't like having debt, which is interesting because your generation, so she's sounding extremely old, but your generation, well, not just your generation, most, certainly my generation too, uh, tend to take debt for granted. Like, that's just how one lives. So was that an idea that you had for yourself? Did that come from your parents? Where did that notion of I want to live within my means and I don't want to have debt, where did
I
that
th-
come from?
oh, I think, well, I was fortunate that because I was living at home through my university days, I was able to sort of pay it off as I went, if that makes
Ah,
sense.
great. Yeah.
So we're in Canada, we don't have the luxury of the HEX or the HELP program that you guys have here in Australia, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing how that program works. I wish we had something like that. But in Canada, if you take out a student loan, um, the minute, I think you get 1 year after you graduate, but after you graduate, it jumps up to like 10% interest or something like that. So it basically becomes a credit card debt that you owe back to the
For the
government.
rest of your life, just about. Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. So I was fortunate to have really helpful parents. Like, my parents were like, "Yeah, we'll help you." My mom and dad paid 50% or something like that, and I paid the other 50%. Like, they were just happy to help see me get through university and that sort of thing. So and I working at the time, saving that kind of money, I think it was really good that I could actually, I wasn't in a position where I was in debt coming out of uni, which was huge, because I think, a lot of people don't have that luxury. But then also put into this position where I was making money with zero overhead. Like, it didn't cost me a cent to be on the ships. I just literally had to go with wherever the ship was going, and if I saved my money, I could get ahead. So I was able to save like a deposit for a house at that time, just in the time that I was away. So it really came in handy. Sorry, just a sec here. There we go. It came in
Sure.
handy. It came in handy when when I did finally decide to settle down and whatnot. But yeah, I think financial freedom is so important, and it's so incredibly difficult these days. At least, like you said, with my generation, like, debt is everywhere. Debt is the common. The debt is so incredibly common that it's it's
Yeah,
it's not very easy to get ahead, because it's so easy to just pay on credit.
absolutely it is. That's right. And some people have. I remember a friend of mine, her boyfriend at the time and their whole family were big on just always max out your credit card and always and go get another credit card and max that one out. And they somehow thought of it as free money. And I'm like, I couldn't fathom it. I don't understand that mentality. But that
Mm.
was like that entire family's mentality. And I suspect that's true for many. Okay, so that's happening. So you've got this financial consciousness, you've got this money consciousness, you're a saver, you're not a spender, you're buying you've got a deposit for a house, you've already met your wife by this stage, so you're buying the house together? Or was
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
yeah,
So once we sort
okay.
of sorted the visa stuff, which I will say was like a massive process, that was like about
Yeah.
about 4.5, 5 years.
Yeah.
But once that was all sorted and we sort of found a nice spot to live, we went down the path of getting the house and all that stuff. So yeah, it was.
So you've gotten interested in money, and you went further down that path, didn't you? So here you are. See, and I find this interesting because you're a muso. You're a professional musician, and artists in general aren't typically renowned for being particularly financially savvy. Not just artists, professionals often are. Like lawyers and doctors are often terrible with money. But that's an interesting dichotomy I find in you. So you've got this kind of left brain that's able to do the numbers stuff, and you've got this right brain that does the creative stuff. How do they marry up in your mind?
That's interesting. I never really thought about it. I think it was probably. I mean, there definitely were. I wouldn't say hardships, but growing up, like when my parents did separate when I was quite young, so my mom was always quite. I probably will say I got a lot of the money, the sort of the desire to be financially stable from my mom. My mom was very much a live within your means type of person. So it was probably a bit of modeling in terms of like, just how to be tight with your money.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, like don't be afraid to go out and spend, and have a good time and spend the money that if you want to, like by all means, but just don't be irresponsible, I suppose is the lesson that I got from her. So I'd say, and my dad as well, I think just sort of, it was probably a parent thing in the sense that I had, probably, I think I had examples in my family of people who were incredibly good with money and also people who were terrible with money. So it was sort of good to see. I don't know. I think I just sort of, I think when I started, getting into Bitcoin and learning about the markets and whatnot, I started realizing that there is money to be made here as well. But it's just about, it's that same sort of fundamental thing, right? It's like where you need to be responsible as well. You need to have sort of, you can't just jump into something and hope for the best, if that makes sense. Like
you've got to be thoughtful about it, and you've got to take, well, there's a little bit with money, and I think this is hard for people, of you've got to take charge of it yourself. Nobody else is going to do it for you. And you can hand it over to a financial advisor or a superannuation firm or a managed fund of some sort. But there's every bit as many scams in those areas and dangers and risks in those areas as there are in the crypto world.
Oh, big time.
So, and you had a really interesting experience that I think ties into this around, was it superannuation in Canada, or what was you were wanting to buy some Bitcoin or some Ethereum?
Oh yeah. So in 17, so I had a friend of mine that I met on the ships, and he was actually an Aussie guy, and he said, look, might sound crazy, but you should be looking at this Bitcoin and this Ethereum thing. Like they're both really, really well known. They're starting to become well known in the market space, and I mean, they're definitely becoming more, they're becoming less volatile assets, blah blah blah. He sort of gave me the spiel, and I sort of thought, okay, cool, like I think I should probably invest. So I was on the ships at the time, and I was looking into actually purchasing some Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin at the time was like, it was well under 10 grand, and Ethereum was like a couple $100 or something like that. And I thought, oh great, like this would be amazing. All right, I'll buy a couple of these Ethereum things and whatever, you know what I mean? You don't really know much about the markets, but you think, oh, I'd love to get into this. So I went to go through the process, and my Canadian bank had actually put a complete lock on my accounts for wanting to purchase crypto. So this was sort of before it was sort of, the banks were sort of allowing or accepting of people wanting to spend their own money how they choose, I guess. But I mean, they weren't exactly very open-minded to me purchasing crypto. So they went and locked the accounts. They made it a real hassle for me to even access any of my money, to the point that I think my accounts were locked for 2 or 3 weeks. Like it was a real nightmare. that I ended up having to call, make these calls while I'm overseas to try and sort the banking stuff out. And anyway, it really put me off crypto at the time, which is
Yeah.
sort of backwards because you
Yeah,
think,
right. Exactly.
yeah, in hindsight, it's really put me off of the banks, but
But
at the
at the
time,
time,
it really put me off of crypto. Yeah, so I sort of thought, oh, I mean, why would I? I'm not going to get involved with this. If the banks think it's risky, then I definitely don't want to be a part of this. Is sort of was my mindset at the time. Fast forward, 5 years, and I'm thinking, oh, really? I wish I spent a bit more time pushing.
I'm actually a little bit surprised at two levels. Obviously, the idea of them freezing your funds at all, particularly back then.
Mm,
Now we're seeing it left, right, and centre. But back then, I'm a bit surprised to hear it. So that says something about Canada. But I'm also actually surprised because I thought Canada was ahead of the curve on crypto, because when I first wanted to invest in Bitcoin and crypto, I ended up buying some Canadian. It was a listed Bitcoin fund,
really?
ETF. Yeah. So because there was nothing available in America or Australia.
Mm,
So I thought Canada was well ahead, but that was only early 2021. So
right.
obviously a lot changed for Canada in that
Mm.
4-year period or whatever it was, three and a half. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. Oh, but I mean, I remember being incredibly frustrated, just at the banks at the time, just because you're just like, it's my money. Let me spend it how I want to spend it.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, so I think that probably fueled the fire for me, wanting to get involved, with the work that Jason and Michael do, as well as, sort of learning how to self-manage my own assets and sort of take care of my own financial future, so that was probably added a bit to that fire. So it was probably a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, as these things often end up being, there's this kind of silver lining, which is you learn something from it and you decide to kind of do something different about it, take your life in a different direction accordingly.
Mm.
So there's, so you started to trade. Uh, let's talk a little bit about your trading journey, and then I want to kind of tie back into Bitcoin. But tell me about that. So you've obviously taken an interest in money and taking responsibility for your money.
Yeah, I gave the short-term trading that was probably more in the recent side of things, probably in the past, year to 10
Okay.
months type
Yeah.
of thing. So I sort of gave that a bit of a crack, thinking, oh, I've got this knowledge of, that I've gained, and I should be able to put it to use. And it chewed me up and spit me out. Not look, nothing crazy. I'm not one of those guys who go, I wasn't trying to be a hero or anything, but at the same time, it was a learning experience, because I realized, just because have a bit of a fundamental knowledge of something, or you've come to learn, it's like there's people who spend their whole lives trying to trade these markets, day in and day out, and they still, can get chewed up if they're not careful. So I don't know. It's definitely a learning experience, but I don't think I'm lining up to make a big old deposit, into a into a short-term trading account anytime soon. But maybe one day I'll have the confidence again to jump back in.
And give that a go. So meanwhile, you've also delved a little bit further into Bitcoin in this time, from the time when you first looked at it. See, I'm interested, you said when you first looked at it back in 2017, you went, I want to get on board with this. Was that just because your mate convinced you of the gains to be made, or did you understand anything more about Bitcoin and or Ethereum at the time?
Well, at the time, I think he definitely helped me to understand, to sort of see the value, just explaining how the blockchain works, all that stuff. That was sort of my introduction to the space. But beyond that, it was probably, there was probably a bit of the, oh, look, I've made 15 times my money or whatever. There's probably a bit of that in there too. But as soon as I started doing my own research, learning about blockchain, learning about how these ecosystems actually function, it really sort of changed my, I suppose, like you said about the two different brains. I'm in two brains about it as well, in the sense that it's a great way to make money, but it's also, I can also see the long term, the technology behind it as well. So I can sort of see the both sides of it, if that makes sense.
So what was the attraction on the technology side and the blockchain side? What excites you about that?
I quite like I think just the fact that the government, not that I'm like an anti-government sort of, guy, but the fact that I can hold something that is, just the way the blockchain works really, really captivated me. Just the fact that it's printed on all of these different, on these different levels that can't be changed, can't be edited. It's concrete, and that store of value sort of thing. It really does. I definitely recognize its limitations, obviously, but at the same time, I definitely can see the inherent value.
What limitations do you see there? That
Oh, for me, I don't know. I'm just some random guy, but for me, I wonder, about Bitcoin, the mining, the way the mining's going, how it's becoming so incredibly difficult to mine, having that sort of thing. I sort of wonder. Again, I could be totally wrong on this, but I just wonder if Bitcoin becomes harder to mine,
Mhm.
will it still be as lucrative? Will the miners still want to put in the work? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Pay the electricity. Unless the value goes. Anyway, I don't know. So that's where I sort of I get a bit confused as to how long term I'm willing to be invested in the space. But again, I don't know. I haven't done enough research into it, I guess.
Yeah, there seemed to be a fair bit of discussion about that, about what happens as you get towards that 21 million mark, and
Yeah.
you've got the halving and the halving and the
Mm.
halving, and
I'm actually curious. I know I'm just curious. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you?
I don't really have any. I really don't
No.
have an informed opinion on that. I
Yeah.
just read bits and pieces on Twitter, but because I'm not a tech person, I'm not good with tech.
Hmm.
So I think the reality is, as Michael Pizzino often says, well, both of them really, is, up, down, or sideways, you've just got to be prepared no matter what.
Hmm.
And I'm in there for the long term. I'm a big believer in what it can do for the world. But I mean, we're looking out at, is it at least 2040? I think even 2080. Because it's a block every 10 minutes or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
But and difficulty adjustments and all of that. So it's not.
Actually, well,
Yeah, go
I
on.
will say, I did look. I just sort of checked the Google Trends not too long ago. I don't know if you check that every now and then, but the Google Trends, I just typed in Bitcoin,
Yeah.
just sort of had a look at the analytics, a couple weeks ago, I think it was, and a lot of the sort of developing countries, Bitcoin is at an all-time high in terms of the search results from some of those places. So
Oh wow.
yeah, some African countries, kind of things like that. I've sort of noticed that. So I can definitely see the transformative effect that it'll have in these type of countries, in third world countries that are still sort of developing. I can definitely see that. Yeah, I can see why. Obviously, in countries where government structures are a bit, less, less stable. You can definitely see I can see where it would come in to be super effective and helpful there.
Well, emerging and developing countries, there's a really obvious use case, as well as authoritarian countries and all sorts of things in terms of that freedom and independence. Funnily enough, I heard Foss was speaking. Greg Foss, do you know Greg Foss, fellow Canadian?
Mm,
He's an ex-Bond guy, 30 years in the bond markets, and now just this huge Bitcoin advocate. And he was speaking at the Amsterdam Bitcoin conference just last week, and he was talking about the potential default of nations. So we used to have default of individuals, and then we started seeing default of companies, and now we're potentially seeing default. We
governments.
have seen default of whole nations, as it
Yeah.
were. And Foss's thought was that Canada might be the first of the G7s to
Mm,
have to default because of the size of the debt,
wow.
which means Canada could be the first of the G7s to see the value proposition for Bitcoin, which of course Foss and
Mm,
Jeff Booth, both really big advocates in
mm,
Canada, would love to, see the uptake of Bitcoin and avoid that
Mm.
looming disaster, as it were.
Well, I do know. I've spoken to some family back home because obviously my family knows I've sort of been diving into Bitcoin and other cryptos,
Yeah.
but yeah, they've actually told me how much easier it is. How much more mainstream it's become over there. Crypto's a lot easier to get a hold of. It's a lot less. Apparently, they've even got these Bitcoin ATMs set up that you can actually purchase. I mean, obviously with ridiculous spreads, but you can go and buy Bitcoin at an ATM and it'll drop it right into a wallet for
We've
you.
got them here in Australia.
Oh,
There's one
really?
at a local shopping centre here.
Oh, cool. Oh,
Yeah,
there you
yeah,
go.
yeah, absolutely. In fact, I met a guy at the Bitcoin conference in Miami who was part of the organization that's setting up those ATMs all over the world.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So how are your family feeling about it, particularly in light of the freezing of the truck driver protests, sort of their accounts? So the idea that they had their money frozen, they had their accounts frozen for protesting. Do you have an opinion on that?
Oh, I
Has
think.
that helped with the Bitcoin take-up and the Bitcoin story in Canada?
Oh, I forgot about that because I remember they try to pay and didn't they pay something in crypto and then it ended up getting frozen or something?
I think,
What happened?
well,
Or sorry, it was they tried to pay in cash. They tried to pay them through bank accounts. The banks froze it, and then they paid in crypto. Is that what
that's
happened?
right. Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Oh, I mean, my family, they're not really big into crypto and whatnot, and whatnot. I'm probably the black sheep and a bit, probably a bit more of a risk taker than most of them. But I do know, I've definitely been, pushing, not pushing, but saying, now's a really good time. Things are looking good for the next little while. Try to, encourage, where I think, they should be looking. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, from what I've heard, it's definitely become more mainstream, in Canada for sure.
So you said that you're quite interested in macro, like you're not quite so sure about the short-term training gig, given that you're up against, hugely experienced and professional traders, of course, but that you're maybe more interested in the macro picture and the long-term thing.
Mm.
And clearly you're accumulating some Bitcoin, you're also paying off, no doubt, a mortgage, or, you're invested in property. Are shares part of your portfolio as well? Are you hedging in all directions?
A little bit. I'm probably more heavy in Bitcoin and Ethereum because I've probably jumped on the Pizzino bandwagon for that, but and I'm cool with that. But also just from a historical, like um, I tend to think that those assets, they've proved themselves over time. So, I'm less inclined to think that they're just going to fall out of the sky and never come back. Like a lot of those altcoins that show up, and but at the same time, I am invested a little bit in stocks. Nothing crazy, a little bit of metals as well, mainly with the super fund. Just so I'm not, don't really want to take as big of risks with the long term stuff. But so I probably have a bit more. I have a bit more exposure into stocks. My wife and I I sort of got my wife on board with the self-managed super thing, so she's super cool and happy to jump in. So we've sort of done that together, which is really cool. But yeah, with that we've got a little bit of in the stock portfolio, but I mean we're pretty happy with the reward to risk, sort of getting into Bitcoin in that space. And
So what are your hopes for it? Do you have an idea? Clearly, you've got some immediate financial goals that, you want to achieve with all of those investments. And you're obviously seeing the use case for Bitcoin in many emerging and totalitarian countries. Do you see that you're seeing greater and greater access to it and normalization of it in Canada and amongst other places, like we're seeing institutional take up across the world? Where do you imagine it going?
mm, I often think about that actually. I sort of wonder. I mean, I can definitely see the use case. I mean, I definitely see the store of value,
Mhm.
how it's an excellent store of value. I hope I'm optimistic. Obviously hope is not really a really good judge, but based on how it's performed in the past and whatnot, looking at the charts, at least to my eye, I'm convinced it will continue, becoming a major player in the markets, like in as a in the stock space. It's definitely becoming more. It's definitely going in the right direction. It's not, in terms of the amount of people who are the flooding into the space, at peaks. Obviously, that's not always a good thing, but in terms of the size of the market cap in general, it's definitely going in the right direction. There's a lot more interest in the space. I definitely see it being here, for the long haul, at least for the next, for the foreseeable future.
Are you holding for the long term regardless of price?
I think, there's a bit of my portfolio I'll probably never want to sell. The
Yep.
Bitcoin, I'll probably hang on to that as like a bit of a moon bag.
Right.
But
Yep.
but at the same time, that's a bit of a, I don't know. I think I want to see how it plays out next cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's so new, and
That's it.
anything could happen really at one level, and a lot of this is projection and hearsay.
The other thing that I was thinking about too, Carrie, is I don't know if you've heard much about it, but the government's, at least the Australian government, has been looking into a digital currency, and they've sort of funded a sort of looking into that. So I just wonder what the implications of that will be if they do sort of pursue their own digital, Australian dollar currency. Will that hinder the Bitcoin market? I don't know, but it's just something to be wary, or at least aware of, right?
How do you feel about a CBDC if it came out? Well, not if, when it comes out.
I think it's inevitable. We're pretty well cashless in most day-to-day life anyway. I don't really seeing it changing all that much.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe,
Do you think
but
of it as dangerous at all? A lot of people are very anti CBDC. How do you feel about it?
I can definitely see actually, you brought up Jordan Peterson. I think he actually did a podcast not too long ago just talking about the risks and the threats associated with that, because obviously, the government can quite literally say, no, you've bought 10 of these, you can't buy an 11th or whatever, it might be. They then, can control your spending, restrict your ability to, restrict your freedoms, financially. So there's definitely a lot to be sort of concerned about, with that.
Absolutely. I'm gonna just flip back to personal for a moment. How are you managing? You're full-time gigging. You're back to making money out of music, which means doing nighttime gigs.
Yeah, I do a lot of shows. I do a lot of sort of weddings and corporate events and private parties, and I also do a bit of the clubs and festivals and that kind of stuff. But that keeps me busy. Usually three nights a week, and then I also do some work throughout the week for NDIS.
Oh, yeah.
So disability, just do a bit of that through the week, which is quite cool. So it's
and
just
how
keeps...
much time do you spend on money, trading, learning?
I wish I could say more. I'd like to ideally, in an ideal world, I'd probably be putting an extra 5 to 10 hours towards that a week. But currently I probably put in a couple hours, maybe an hour a day. I'd like to put in more. I'd like to eventually get to the point where, that's sort of the bread and butter, but I don't know. We'll have to play it by ear.
Are you, I've got to ask, are you planning on kids?
Oh, eventually, probably.
Eventually.
Yeah. It's gotta. My wife, it's quite funny. She's a teacher, so she gets her kid fix at school at the moment. So.
All right. So will that be a problem, having nighttime gigs once you've got kids? Have you thought that far ahead?
Oh no, I can't see it being a problem. I'm just excited to have a little piano playing, guitar playing kid of my own. One day, maybe. I don't know.
Gorgeous would that be? Maybe you can set up a dad and bub band,
It'll
I can
happen. Watch
see you
it.
on TikTok now.
Yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. That's feeling like a really positive, lovely note to finish up on. Dan, is there anything that we've missed that you were really hoping we might cover, that you feel like we didn't get into deeply enough? Because I'm really happy to extend it if there's something that you felt, oh, I was hoping we might chat about.
Oh, no, I think it's been great, Carrie. I really appreciate your time and thanks for having me. It's been awesome.
It's been absolutely a pleasure to meet you in person and to put a face to the name. I will look forward to seeing you back online. If people want to look up your music, by the way, what website or where should they be going to look up their music if they want to find out?
Yeah, I'm Danny Shamess is my name. They can just find me on social media on Facebook, Instagram, all that fun stuff. So yeah.
I'll put that in the show notes.
Oh,
Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure. You be well, my friend, and I'll look forward to being in touch. Take care
great.
for now. See
Bye,
you.
Carrie. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.